Hello friends, this is your friend Professor Iqbal here, and once again I welcome all of you to my YouTube channel specially designed for NET sector students, those who want to appear for these exams. Now in this episode of lecture we are going to discuss lyrical ballads, which is very essential as far as NET set examination is concerned. Now I would like to divide these lyrical ballads into 6 points which are quite essential for any student of literature to understand what actually is there in lyrical ballads, as well as preface to lyrical ballads. Our main intention is to study preface to lyrical ballads, and we are going to just see the introduction of what is lyrical ballad and appendix which is added at the end of this essay. Now when it comes to lyrical ballad, let us take some introduction about this topic. Lyrical ballad was published in the year 1798 and it was a jointly written work by William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge, whereas the contribution of S.T. Coleridge is very less, hardly 4 poems contributed by him in his first edition. Now when it comes to lyrical ballads, he just published poems in this collection to know the response of the readers, and he just wanted to approach the readers in the language of a layman, that is the language spoken by the common man, and his effort was really overheld by the readers and everybody appreciated his efforts. And then after that, by the request of others and his friends also clamored to add a prefix, and then he comes out with a prefix that is called as Preface to Lyrical Ballads, which was published in the year 1800. Now he added a preface to know what was the response of the reader, what actually he had done. And in this essay, Preface to Lyrical Ballads, he discusses why did he try to write in the language of a common man, why it was important for him to write in that language. So we are going to see what the contemporary writers did at that time, his views on contemporary writers. This will be the first point of our discussion. Now the poetry before him was quite dull and trivial, and the poets, they used to write in heavy and complex language, and this is something which motivated him to take the poetry to a common man. So dull, complex, heavy, loaded language is something which will keep a common man away from the poetry, and his effort was to reach a common person, to reach a commoner in order to evoke his feelings. Now these poets, they were still started to continue their practice, but there was no such a point which really kept them detached from each other. But above all, his other intention was to know the difference between poets and the poetry. And to see, this is the second point of discussion. In the second point of discussion, we are going to see what is poetry and what are the poets. Poets, according to William Wordsworth, should write in the language of a common man, and whatever the emotions and the feelings they convey in their poetry should reach to a person who really lives it. Now his intention was that the common man should understand the purpose of writing poetry, and that is something what he thought over, because poetry is nothing but the emotions which are evoked in writing. For him, poetry was a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. There is no doubt these are the feelings of a common man, these are the feelings of poet, there is no doubt, but it should touch a layman, it should evoke a layman to understand that. He also says about poetry that there should not be excessively usage of figures of speech. He says that continuous use of figures of speech will make the poetry more decorative, it will make the poetry quite trivial, and the real purpose of writing poetry will be kept aside. And then she goes on. The third point which we are going to discuss is the difference between the prose and poetry. What William Wordsworth finds is that there is no such a difference between prose and poetry, only the meter differs. So prose and poetry, there is no such a difference, both of them, they share the same way or the medium of communication. Their intention is to communicate something, so they have only one intention of communication, and he says there is no such a difference between language of prose and language of poetry. So poetic language and prose, there is no such a difference at all, only the meter. So meter is used by the poets in order to delight the reader, to give them pleasure. That is what he says, and he differs poetry and prose. Before him, the poets, they had taken it granted that the poetry is written in the language which they were actually doing. So they were not only writing imaginatively, they were also using enough figures of speech, and they were trying to make their poetry decorative. But what he tried to do in his concept, he just tried to simplify it. He just tried to approach the common people by writing in the words of a common people. That is what he says. A poet is nothing but a man speaking to men. It means his intention, his emotions, his reality should be given to the common person, and then only they will understand the real purpose of writing a poem. Now after that, the next point which is very essential for us to discuss is his appendix. In his appendix, which was published in the year 1802, that is called as poetic language. That is what he totally discusses with poetic diction. So when he talks about poetic diction, he says earlier the poets, they used to write powerfully, they used to write when the passion excited them to write. But now the later period, the poet, they just went on writing. Okay, so their writing was quite imaginary, heavy loaded and dull and complex one. There was no such emotion of passion excited and other things. At the same time, when he talks about poetry, the most important point which is necessary for us to understand, there are 4 stages of poetry, what Wordsworth says, in order to understand what is a good poetry. The first essential point what he says is observation. The second one is recollection, and third point is contemplation, and the fourth one which is very essential is nothing but expression. Observation, recollection, contemplation and expression. These 4 essential points are there as far as poetry is concerned. So any poet who wants to write a poetry must have all these 4 points observed while writing this itself. Okay, now let us understand what is the meaning of all these points. So the first point, what is his observation? Before writing a poem, a poet observes. Okay, a poet observes an object, or he observes the things which are there. So the natural phenomenon, that is the nature, is observed, and he immediately doesn't shape those things into a poem. So he lets the ideas sink into his mind, and after that he recollects those ideas in contemplation and finally gives it a touch with the expression. Now see, in order to produce good poetry, you need to go through all these 4 points. There should be good observation, and then there should be recollection, and then there should be contemplation, and then should be the final touch, that is called as expression. And because of this reason, he says all good poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. What does this mean? All good poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility, in the sense it is spontaneous, which is immediate and sudden, not pre-planned. So he makes his opinion clear in his appendix, where earlier poets, they used to write when the passion excited them, but now everything has changed. It has become only a trend to write in the language of poetry which was followed by the people. So the meter was very essential for Wordsworth. He tried to observe those things as far as poetry is concerned. And the last point which we are going to discuss is reaction of critics. Many critics were not really happy with what William Wordsworth had done. His approach to write in the language of a common man was not truly satisfied. That is what the critics say. And he also says that he doesn't worry about these opinions of critics, because he writes only for the readers who belong to a common life. He just wanted to approach. According to him, poetry should reach to the doors of a layman, and it should provide them pleasure, it should give them a joy, and then only the real intention of writing poetry will be done. So this is something what he said. But many critics, they say that William Wordsworth has not observed the things which he actually says. Giving reference to Solitary Reaper, they say the words like behold, okay, the words like behold, these are quite heavy words. Word like behold, instead of to see or instead of to watch, using the word like behold are many more. Okay, these words are quite contradictory to his opinion, his ideas, what he actually did in Preface to Lyrical Ballads. his friend requested him no doubt to write something which was quite different from others. His efforts were also really appreciated by many poets, many readers, but what he was trying to do is just trying to approach, just trying to go closer to the common man who were really living in the life of a people of people who were quite away from the reality and the world. So these were the essential points what we need to understand as far as NET exam is concerned. The first point we spoke about introduction, and in the introduction we saw how lyrical ballad came into existence, and that is the beginning of the romantic movement in English literature, that is in the year 1798. And after the friends, they insisted him to write a preface. He was not ready to write it initially. He was not ready to write it initially, but his friends approached him. They requested him to write a preface, and after some time he added a preface to know the response of the readers, and the readers were really very delighted to see what he actually had done. And then he was also appreciated for doing that, and he made it very clear to the reader what is a good poetry and what is a complex poetry, a poetry which is not well written. And then after that we also saw what were his views on contemporary poets. Okay, they were using heavy language, their poetry was dull, complex, which was far above the understanding level of the common man. What were his views on poetry and poets? We have also seen what were his views on poetry and poets. And then the next point what he discusses is difference between the language of poetry and the language of prose. And then what after that we also saw the point that is an appendix, which particularly talks about poetic diction and how the earlier poets used to write and how the contemporary poets were writing, and pointed him to write, and he gives some examples like Dr. Johnson, Gray. Okay, these were the poets who were not adhering this formula of writing poetry. And then finally the conclusion is that this is a great piece of work of art which is produced by William Wordsworth. He really has done something which we really need to appreciate and understand. So this is something I wanted to tell you about Preface to Lyrical Ballad, which is an essay added after the request of his friends, and it was fruitful. Really we could understand his purpose of writing poetry, and he differentiates between good poetry and exaggerated poetry and how it should be written well. So thank you everyone for watching this video. I hope this video will really be useful to you in order to understand what is Preface to Lyrical Ballads. Have a good day ahead. Thank you very much.